Welcome to the Allison Knows podcast, everybody. Today, we're going to do a deep dive into some seriously controversial claims about the 2024 U.S. presidential election.
Oh, yeah. It's a topic that's been sparking a lot of debate, and, we're here to unpack it all.
That's right. We're talking about voter suppression and whether it's the real reason that Kamala Harris lost, as investigative journalist Greg Palast argues. We've got some compelling data and some really shocking personal stories.
We'll be looking at excerpts from Palast's interview on The Roland Martin Show and other related materials.
Okay, so let's get right into it. Palast is making a really bold claim. He's saying that Harris would have won by millions of votes, securing 286 electoral votes, enough to win if it wasn't for targeted voter suppression.
Wow. That's a huge margin, and it raises serious questions about the fairness and the integrity of our electoral process.
Yeah, it's mind-blowing. He's talking about almost 5 million voters purged from rolls in 23 states. How is that even legal?
Well, it's not as simple as it seems. There's a legal loophole stemming from a Supreme Court case that allows states to remove voters who haven't participated in recent elections.
But doesn't that directly clash with the National Voter Registration Act? I thought that law was supposed to protect voters' right to skip elections without being kicked off the rolls.
You're absolutely right. There is a conflict. And this is where Palast's investigation gets really interesting. His team didn't just take the purge list at face value. They went the extra mile,
Wow.
verifying addresses using data from Amazon and even the U.S. Postal Service.
Wait, so they actually cross-checked voter rolls with online shopping and mail delivery records?
Yeah.
That's some serious detective work.
Exactly. And what they found was really shocking. In Georgia alone, almost 200,000 voters were wrongly purged because of these false claims that they moved.
So they were still living at the addresses listed on their voter registration.
Precisely. And when Palast's team kind of dug deeper into a sample of those purged voters, they discovered a disturbing pattern. They were overwhelmingly African American.
Wow, that's a huge red flag. It suggests that these purges might not be as random or as innocent as they seem.
Right. And this wasn't just happening in Georgia. Palast found similar patterns in other states, too, like Wisconsin, where Black voters in Milwaukee were disproportionately targeted for purging.
So it's starting to look like a systemic issue, not just these isolated incidents.
Exactly. When you see these patterns repeating across multiple states, it's hard to dismiss the possibility of intentional disenfranchisement.
Okay, so we've got these massive voter purges, and then we have the issue of mail-in ballots. Palast's research reveals some staggering statistics about Black voters being far more likely to have their mail-in ballots rejected.
Yeah, it's incredibly disheartening. And the reasons for these rejections are often baffling. We're talking about things like a missing middle initial or a signature that doesn't perfectly match the one on file.
But those seem like minor technicalities.
Yeah.
How could something like that lead to someone losing their right to vote?
Well, that's the problem. These seemingly small errors create opportunities for bias and potentially discriminatory practices. It's important to remember that many states still include racial data on their voter rolls.
So if someone is reviewing ballots and they can see the voter's race, it could even subconsciously influence their decision-making.
Precisely. Even without explicit intent to discriminate, the system itself is structured in a way that allows for bias to creep in. And that's why it's so crucial to have strong safeguards in place to ensure that every vote is counted fairly, regardless of the voter's race or background.
This is honestly pretty scary stuff. It's not just about individual voters losing their voice. It's about the potential for these practices to actually swing elections.
Absolutely. When you consider the razor-thin margins we often see in elections, even a small number of rejected ballots could be enough to tip the scales in one direction or another.
Which brings us back to Palast's claim about Kamala Harris. He's saying that these voter suppression tactics cost her roughly 3,565,000 votes.
That's right. And if you add those votes back in, she wouldn't just have won the popular vote, she would have won it by a landslide and secured enough electoral votes to win the presidency.
It's really mind-boggling to think about the potential consequences of these practices. We're not just talking about abstract numbers here, we're talking about the future of our democracy.
It's a sobering thought, and it underscores the importance of staying vigilant and informed about these issues. The right to vote is the cornerstone of our democracy, and we cannot take it for granted.
And speaking of not taking things for granted, this might be a good time to remind our listeners to like, subscribe, and share this podcast on Spotify and YouTube. The more people we can reach with this information, the better.
I completely agree. Knowledge is power, and in this case, it's the power to protect our democracy.
Now, Palast doesn't just stop at voter purges and mail-in ballot rejections. He also dives into the issue of provisional ballots, which he calls placebo ballots. Why is that?
Well, it's because provisional ballots often give voters a false sense of security. They're essentially backup ballots given to a voter if there's a question about their eligibility meant to be counted later after verification.
Okay, that sounds reasonable enough. What's the problem?
Well, the problem is that these provisional ballots are frequently rejected for the same minor technicalities we discussed earlier. And guess what? Voters of color are 3 times more likely to be given a provisional ballot in the first place.
So they're being pushed into this separate, less reliable voting system that's more likely to result in their vote being thrown out.
Exactly. And the statistics are alarming. The U.S. Election Assistance Commission reports that a whopping 43% of all provisional ballots are thrown out.
That's outrageous. Almost half of those ballots just end up in the trash.
Yeah, it's a clear indication that the system is failing to live up to its promise of ensuring that every eligible voter's voice is heard.
Palast brings this issue to life with a heartbreaking story about Major General Gaylord Turner, who had to fly 5,000 miles to fight for his right to vote after being wrongly challenged.
It's a powerful example of the lengths some people have to go to just to exercise their fundamental right. It's also indicative of a broader trend of vigilante voter challenges, often based on flimsy or inaccurate information.
Wait, vigilante voter challenges? What does that even mean?
Well, it means that self-appointed individuals, often with partisan agendas, are taking it upon themselves to challenge the eligibility of voters, especially Black voters. These challenges can happen right there at the polls, making it extremely difficult for voters to respond effectively.
Hold on, you're telling me that anyone can just walk up and challenge someone's right to vote based on nothing more than suspicion?
That's essentially what's happening, and the numbers are staggering. One Trump-affiliated group alone challenged over 378,000 voters.
That's chilling. It sounds like something straight out of the Jim Crow era.
The historical parallels are undeniable. And what's even more concerning is the lack of transparency and accountability surrounding these practices. Even obtaining data on challenged and rejected votes is a struggle, which makes it difficult to fully assess the scale of the problem.
Palast uses a stark phrase to describe this situation. He calls it the Klux Klan Plan of 1946. That's heavy stuff.
It speaks to the gravity of the situation and the urgent need to address these issues before they further erode trust in our elections. We need greater oversight, stricter regulations, and a renewed commitment to protecting the right to vote for all citizens.
Yeah, it's a stark warning and one we can't afford to ignore. The fact that these tactics are being used so openly, often without any consequences, should be a wake-up call for all of us.
You know, it's a reminder that the fight for voting rights is far from over. We need to be vigilant and proactive in protecting our democracy.
So what can we do about it? Is there any hope of turning things around?
There's always hope, but it requires action. We can't just sit back and let this happen. Voter education is crucial, especially among young people who might not be aware of these tactics or their rights.
You're right. They're the future of our democracy, and they need to be equipped to protect it. We need to empower them to understand the system, their rights, and fight back against any attempts to silence their voices.
Absolutely. We also need to support organizations that are working tirelessly on the ground to combat voter suppression groups, like the NAACP, Black Voters Matter, and the Transformative Justice Coalition are doing incredible work, but they need our support.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel helpless in the face of these massive systemic issues. They don't know where to start or what they can actually do to make a difference.
I understand that feeling, but the truth is, even small actions can have a ripple effect.
I'm all ears.
Yeah.
Let's give our listeners some concrete steps they can take.
First and foremost, check your voter registration status. Make sure you're registered to vote. You can do this online through your state's election website. It only takes a few minutes, but it's a crucial first step.
And remember, this isn't just a one-time thing. Do this regularly, especially before every election, to make sure you haven't been purged or challenged without your knowledge.
That's a great point. It's also important to be aware of deadlines and any specific requirements in your state. Some states have early voting periods, absentee voting options, or even same-day voter registration.
It's like a cheat sheet for democracy.
Yeah.
Make sure you know the rules of the game so you can play it effectively.
Exactly. And if you encounter any problems or have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to your local election officials or a nonpartisan organization for help. They're there to assist you.
Another thing that comes to mind is spreading the word. Talk to your friends, family, and community members about the issue of voter suppression. Share this podcast with them. The more people who are aware of these tactics, the harder it will be for them to succeed.
I couldn't agree more. Awareness is the first step toward action. We need to shine a light on these practices and demand accountability from our elected officials.
We also need to hold the media accountable for how they report on these issues. Too often, voter suppression is either ignored or downplayed, which allows it to continue unchecked.
You're raising a crucial point. The media has a responsibility to provide accurate and comprehensive coverage of these issues, not just during election cycles, but year-round.
Yeah, we need investigative journalism like Palace's to uncover these hidden stories and bring them to light. But we also need mainstream media outlets to amplify those stories and hold those in power accountable.
That's the key. We need a multi-pronged approach. Grassroots activism, legal challenges, legislative reform, and media scrutiny. It's a long game, but the stakes are too high to give up.
Palace mentions that even if someone hasn't voted in a couple of elections, they should re-register, especially if they think they might be a target for purging.
That's a smart move. It's better to be safe than sorry. And for students who might be moving frequently, it's essential to understand how changing your address can affect your voter registration.
There are so many little things that can trip people up. It's almost like the system is designed to be confusing.
It can feel that way, and that's why it's so important to seek out information and support from trusted sources. Don't let the complexity of the system discourage you from participating.
Palace also talks about something called the poison postcard system. Can you explain what that is?
Sure, it's a tactic where voters are sent postcards to confirm their address. If the postcard isn't returned, the voter could be flagged for removal from the voter rolls even if they haven't actually moved.
So it's like a trap designed to catch people off guard and disenfranchise them without their knowledge.
That's essentially the goal. It's a prime example of how seemingly innocuous procedures can be weaponized for voter suppression.
Palace emphasizes the importance of being prepared for last-minute challenges. He says that vigilantes can challenge a vote on election day without even notifying the voter beforehand. That's terrifying.
Yeah, it is. It's a tactic designed to create chaos and confusion, especially in areas with high concentrations of black voters. The goal is to intimidate and discourage people from voting.
So what can voters do to protect themselves from these last-minute challenges?
The best defense is knowledge. Be aware of your rights, understand the challenge process in your state, and know what documentation you might need to present if you're challenged at the polls.
It's like having a voter protection plan. Know your rights, be prepared, and don't back down.
Exactly. And if you witness any suspicious activity or believe that your rights are being violated, don't hesitate to report it to election officials or a nonpartisan organization like the Election Protection Hotline.
This is where the power of community comes in. We need to look out for each other and make sure everyone has the opportunity to vote freely and fairly.
Solidarity is essential in the fight against voter suppression. We need to stand together and demand that our democracy lives up to its ideals.
Palace also talks about the importance of demanding data transparency. Why is that so crucial?
Because without transparency, it's impossible to fully understand the scope of the problem or hold those in power accountable. We need access to data on voter purges, challenged ballots, and rejected votes to identify patterns and root out discriminatory practices.
It's like trying to solve a crime without knowing the evidence. We need the data to connect the dots and expose the truth.
That's a great analogy. And we can't rely on the government to voluntarily provide this data. We need to demand it through Freedom of Information Act requests, lawsuits, and public pressure.
We also need to hold the Democratic Party accountable for its role in this right. Palace criticizes them for not doing enough to combat voter suppression.
He makes a valid point. The Democratic Party, as the party that supposedly champions voting rights, needs to step up and make this a top priority. They need to invest resources, organize on the ground, and push for meaningful legislative reforms.
It's not enough to just talk about the importance of voting rights. They need to put their money where their mouth is and fight for every vote.
That's what leadership looks like, and frankly, it's what's needed to save our democracy.
Palace says that he and other activists are planning their next move to protect votes. He's working with groups like the NAACP, Black Voters Matter, and Reverend Jesse Jackson's Rainbow PSH Coalition.
That's encouraging to hear.
Right.
It's a reminder that there are people out there who are dedicated to this fight and won't give up easily.
Yeah, and it underscores the power of collective action. When we come together, we can make a difference.
That's the spirit. We can't let cynicism or despair paralyze us. There's too much at stake.
Palace ends by challenging those running for DNC chair, asking them, when are you going to take on Jim Crow and stop hiding on this issue?
It's a powerful question that deserves a serious answer. We need leaders who are willing to stand up and fight for what's right, even when it's difficult.
He also mentions that Reverend Jesse Jackson asked both Kamala Harris and Joe Biden to watch his film Vigilante Inc., America's New Vote Suppression Hitman, and do something about it.
It's a reminder that even those in positions of power need to be educated and held accountable on this issue. We can't assume that they understand the gravity of the situation or are willing to act without pressure from the public.
Yeah, he says that Harris responded by saying she would sign the John Lewis Voting Rights Act if she got elected.
But as Pallas pointedly says, if you don't do something before the election, you ain't going to get elected.
It's a stark reminder that we can't wait for others to save us. We need to take action now before it's too late.
That's the message we need to carry with us as we move forward. Complacency is not an option.
And we can't forget about those who are already disenfranchised, like the 92-year-old woman in Atlanta who was thrown out of the polling station where she had voted for 50 years.
Her story is heartbreaking, but it's also a testament to the resilience of those who are determined to exercise their right to vote no matter the obstacles.
Powis says that she was Martin Luther King Jr.'s cousin.
Wow. If they can target someone like that, it's clear that no one is immune to these tactics.
It's a chilling thought, but it's also a call to action. We need to honor her legacy and the legacy of all those who fought for voting rights by continuing the struggle today.
Absolutely. We stand on the shoulders of giants, and we owe it to them to carry the torch forward.
Pallas emphasizes that this is a 24/7, 365-day-a-year fight. We can't afford to let our guard down even during off-election years.
That's right. The forces of voter suppression are constantly at work finding new ways to disenfranchise and silence voices.
We need to match their intensity with our own unwavering commitment to protecting the right to vote for all.
That's the only way to ensure that our democracy remains a government of the people, by the people, for the people.
And before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let me just remind everyone to like, subscribe, and share this podcast on Spotify and YouTube. We need to get this information out to as many people as possible.
Absolutely. Knowledge is power, and the more people who are aware of these issues, the better equipped we'll be to fight back.
Now, as we move into the final part of our deep dive, I think it's time to talk about solutions. What can we as individuals and as a society do to combat these voter suppression tactics?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, right? It's easy to get overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the problem, but we have to remember that we're not powerless. There are concrete steps we can take to protect our democracy.
Pallas offers some suggestions in his work, and I'd love to hear your insights on those strategies.
He's absolutely right to emphasize voter education. It's the foundation of a strong democracy. We need to make sure that all voters, especially younger generations who might be less familiar with these tactics, understand the system, know their rights, and are prepared to fight back against any attempts to silence their votes.
Yeah, he made a great point about students, too. They move around a lot, which can make them particularly vulnerable to being purged from the rolls.
It's like a moving target for voter suppression efforts. We need to make sure students understand how to maintain their registration even if they change addresses. It might seem like a hassle, but it's a small price to pay for protecting your right to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And he also recommends getting active in nonpartisan organizations that are fighting voter suppression. It's not about picking sides, it's about defending democracy.
Absolutely. Groups like Black Voters Matter, the NAACP, the Transformative Justice Coalition, they're doing incredible work on the ground, and they need our support. Whether it's volunteering your time, donating resources, or simply spreading the word every little bit helps.
He also encourages supporting organizations like the Southwest Voter Registration Education Project. They've been fighting for voting rights for decades, and their work is more important now than ever.
It's inspiring to see these organizations standing up for what's right, even in the face of immense challenges. They're a reminder that we're not alone in this fight. There's a whole network of people dedicated to protecting our democracy.
And it's not just about national organizations. Local groups are also doing amazing work in their communities. Find out what's happening in your area and get involved.
That's where real change starts. At the grassroots level, where people are coming together to support each other and fight for their rights. It's about building a movement, one conversation, one action at a time.
You know, Pallas is also pretty critical of the Democratic Party for not taking a stronger stance against voter suppression.
Yeah, he makes a valid point. As the party that claims to champion voting rights, they need to step up and make this a top priority. It's not enough to just pay lip service to the issue. They need to put their resources and their political capital where their mouth is.
They need to walk the walk, not just talk the talk. We need to see concrete action, legislative reforms, and a real commitment to fighting for every vote.
Exactly. And we as citizens need to hold their feet to the fire. We need to demand that they make this a priority and support candidates who are willing to fight for our right to vote.
You know, Pallas tells the story of a 92-year-old woman in Atlanta who was thrown out of the polling station where she'd voted for 50 years. It's a story that really stays with you.
It's a stark reminder of how vulnerable our democracy is and how determined some are to silence voices, especially those of Black voters. We can't let them win. We have to fight back with even greater determination.
Yeah, this woman's story is a call to action for all of us. We can't let apathy or complacency allow this to happen again. Every vote matters, and we need to protect every single one.
It's about more than just individual votes. It's about the soul of our nation. It's about who we are as a people and what we stand for.
And Pallas stresses that this isn't just about election season, it's a year-round fight.
He's absolutely right. The forces of voter suppression don't take a break, and neither can we. We need to be vigilant, stay informed, and keep the pressure on those in power to protect our democracy.
We need to make sure that everyone who is eligible to vote is able to do so without fear, intimidation, or unnecessary obstacles.
Yeah.
It's the foundation of a fair and just society.
Well said. It's a fight worth having, and I believe that together we can win it.
You know, it's easy to feel overwhelmed or even hopeless when confronted with these kinds of systemic issues. But Pallas's work is a powerful reminder that knowledge is power. The more we understand about how these tactics work, the better equipped we are to fight back.
I couldn't agree more. And it's not just about individual knowledge, it's about collective awareness. We need to have these conversations, share this information, and raise our voices together.
It's about demanding transparency, holding those in power accountable, and supporting organizations that are on the front lines of this fight.
Exactly. It's about taking action both individually and collectively to ensure that our democracy truly reflects the will of the people.
Pallas's investigation reveals a disturbing truth about our electoral system. But it also offers a glimmer of hope, because by exposing these tactics, he's empowering us to fight back.
It's a call to action for all of us. We can't afford to be complacent. The future of our democracy depends on our engagement and our willingness to stand up for what's right.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into voter suppression and the 2024 election. I hope you found this episode informative and, most importantly, motivating.
I second that this isn't just about politics. It's about our shared future. It's about ensuring that our democracy reflects the will of the people.
Remember, knowledge is power, and action is what transforms that power into real change. Don't let anyone silence your voice. Get out there, get involved, and fight for your right to vote.
And never underestimate the power of one voice, one vote. Together, we can make a difference.
If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this episode with your friends and family. The more people we can reach with this information, the better equipped we'll all be to protect our democracy.
Absolutely. Spreading awareness is crucial. We need to shine a light on these issues and keep the conversation going.
Thank you for listening to the Allison Knows podcast. Don't forget to follow Allison on Bluesky YouTube and TikTok for more deep dives into the issues that matter. Until next time, stay curious and stay engaged.